Hi, my name is Tim Fort, and I want to welcome you to a monthly, year-long program where we're going to explore how cultural touchstones can provide an opportunity for increasing social harmony and overcoming the distances that have separated us because of the coronavirus. This was originally set up to be a TED Talk back in the very 1st of March, but as it turned out, the very 1st of February, I had 4 book manuscripts due all on the same day, all on February 1st. Got them all done. But after that, frankly, I was just worn out. And so I contacted the TED Talk organizers and said, I just don't think that I can pull this off. Can I defer and do it later? And they were very gracious to me and said, yes, we'll be doing it again next year, and we can, welcome to have your contribution at that point. But I kept kind of fiddling with this because what I wanted to talk about is something that I think is important. It's certainly important to me. And so I kept kind of doodling on the ideas that I had. And then in early February, of course, the coronavirus is starting to hit and get worse and worse. And I was looking at that thinking, well, maybe this will make a difference. In fact, I was interviewing a fellow who was for a job in our university. And he said, well, maybe the coronavirus was the thing that will bring us together. Frankly, I've been a little bit disappointed that we haven't come more together than what we have. And that brings me back to the motivation that I had last fall to want to do this presentation and to do the TED Talk and to explore really on a bigger basis what these various cultural artifacts might be able to provide us. So if you go back into last fall, the Atlantic Monthly had an issue with the front cover entitled, "How to Stop a Civil War." How to stop a civil war? We've reached that point. And the issue backed off a little bit in that we're not there yet, but it was speaking a little bit more metaphorically, but not in total. And even the editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Goldberg, was quoted in the issue saying that we are becoming contemptuous of each other in ways that are both dire and possibly irreversible. Just how we treat each other, how we treat each other when we disagree, the demonization that we provide of each other is problematic. It's dangerous, and it can have dangerous impacts on our society. Well, talking about issues of social harmony and peace and things like that is something of a professional interest to me. I've written 4 books over the last 20 years of how business and workplace issues can contribute to peace. Sometimes that's not the case. I mean, sometimes the businesses can foment violence. I'm not arguing that that's not the case, but I do think that there is an opportunity when we go to work and what businesses do in order to foster peace. And the reason for that is that I am a business ethicist. I've been teaching that for 34 years now. And I've noticed that the commonly accepted ethical business practices that most people advocate for tend to correlate fairly well with attributes that have been identified as nonviolent societies. And so I've written these books and a whole bunch of articles and run a bunch of conferences on this idea. I mean, this is really where my career has been. I mean, what can we do in our everyday lives, even at work, in order to make the world a more peaceful place? And then in the last 4 or 5 years, I've expanded that to go beyond business, to run several conferences. And now we have a book forthcoming on music, business, and peace, what music can do, how music can be a cultural touchstone to help us get along better, to find common ground with each other. And I've run a film series with Indiana University Cinema on cultural foundations for peace, where I depict how films depict ways in which we can think about building peace as well. And that includes and goes even further to look at sports. And so there's lots of cultural touchstones that I argue in my professional life can make a difference in the way that we treat each other and can make us think, or to nudge us to think in ways that are more peaceful, more harmonious, more civil, more kind than what might otherwise be the case. So I have this professional interest, but I also have a personal interest too. These are my kids. As you can see, we are a diverse lot. I have 2 internationally adopted children and a biological child. We're kind of a mini United Nations running around town all the time. And not only do I have a very strong, passionate belief in diversity, but I know how you can be diverse and also be a unit, a one unit, a family. And I also want to make sure that in their lives, I want to do what I can in order to contribute to a society that makes their lives, as different as they all look, safer, more productive, um, more harmonious. And so I have both a professional and a personal interest in doing this. Now, one thing that I have concluded, having been a father now for 20 years, and been, so the personal interest and the professional interest in terms of writing all these books and stuff like that, is that if there's one thing that we need to do more than anything else, it's that we need to destroy our enemies. We must, and I mean that. We must see our enemies, we must identify our enemies, and we must destroy them exactly the way that Abraham Lincoln talked about. Because if you make your enemies your friends, you did destroy them because they're no longer your enemies. And so I want to argue, or I want to suggest here, that there are ways for us to find common ground, or even differences that we can respect when there is no common ground, that we can at least embrace each other in a way. We can respect each other in a way that is harmonious even among our differences. Now, it is true that external enemies, finding an external enemies, is one way that we become, well, I don't know about friends, but at least allies. It makes us maybe sometimes strange bedfellows when we're faced with a crisis, but I don't know if that's necessarily the same as being friends. And what's worse is in the midst of the coronavirus, what we have seen with a modern day plague is that we have to separate ourselves from each other. So it's not like we can go shake hands or slap each other on the back or do those kinds of things in order to try to get to know each other better. We need to distance ourselves from each other in order to make each other safe. And so that almost by itself runs the risk of making us strangers. And so we're at an unusual time where I think that we both need to find ways for us to find common ground and respect each other and find ways to be friends with each other. And at the same time, that we are in a position where we're more likely to be strangers to each other. I realize the internet gives us the possibility to do this, but this is still a challenge for us. Now, maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe we're really not enemies. I hope that we're not enemies. Maybe it's just this notion of strangers that we really are. That it's not trying to convert people from being enemies to friends, but strangers to friends. And don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying that we should, close down our political viewpoints or not to be passionate about what we believe in. I think that we should be civically engaged, go out and vote and advocate. I think that we should do all of those things. But you can do all those things and vote and still be friends and disagree with the people who are voting in the other direction. In fact, I grew up on a farm in a very, very conservative rural area of the Midwest. I have been a professor, and universities tend to be much more liberal, for 34 years. If I can't find a way to talk to people who disagree with me, I don't have anybody to talk to, because I'm kind of in the middle of everything. And I will typically find something about what someone is saying that I'm not so crazy about from a political standpoint. But I got to find a way, just in order to live, to find a way to be able to relate to those people. So I suppose that's another kind of a personal interest that I have in all this, that I think that we need to find ways, and I believe we can find ways, to be politically engaged and at the same time find ways to embrace each other, to respect each other, to find common ground with each other. Now, of course, it's better if we can be so close to each other that we're kind of breathing together, or to be able to embrace each other with a big hug or something like that. But if those things aren't available for us, given the conditions that we currently are in, that just means our other senses have to work a little bit harder, right? And what I want to suggest primarily for today is that I think our best friends, our dogs, and if your best friend is a cat or a turtle or whatever, I'm completely okay with that, but I'm running with dogs here. So our best friends can actually help us take some baby steps, puppy steps, in order to get there. I think that they can help show us see how we can find ways to productively live together in a harmonious kind of a way. Now, in other times throughout this next year, I'm going to be talking about other cultural touchstones like music, like sports, like film, like business, maybe even religion. But I want to start off with dogs. And if we can't use these senses of breathing with each other or touching each other, then the sense I think that might help us the most is our listening sense. Use those ears. Use those ears in order to bring in the sounds of what we are hearing, of what others' cultural touchstones are. And so one thing I want to encourage us to do is to identify what our cultural touchstones are. I'll identify that a little bit more here in just a second. But I also want to encourage us to really find ways to listen, to use our ears to be our other cultural touchstones. Just like my Basset Hound Hazel, helped by my daughter, will show us. Now, this next example isn't about dogs, but let me backtrack here for a second, because I do this presentation, as you'll see throughout the year, with respect to sports, music, film, those kinds of things. I had a unique experience in that I'm a two-time graduate of the University of Notre Dame, a double domer, even though I'm not Catholic, which was one of the interesting things about being at Notre Dame, was that I was not a Catholic. But I was also a professor later in my life for 11 years at the University of Michigan. I mean, these two schools, universities, I just think are fabulous universities. I really do. I adore both of them greatly, and I can never repay either university for everything that they did in my life. Having said that, I cannot root for the University of Michigan in football because I'm a Notre Dame graduate. I just can't do it. I mean, this is a serious rivalry. Notre Dame, Michigan is a serious rivalry, and I played that to the hilt when I was a professor there. I wore my Notre Dame stuff all over Ann Arbor. And I loved to walk down the street with some Notre Dame thing on, just to hear the sound of grinding teeth as the person walked past me. My wife did the same thing. My wife is not a Notre Dame graduate, and she could care less about football either, but she would wear her Notre Dame stuff to the gym also to just have the same experience. I mean, this is a really serious rivalry. And so on the Monday or Tuesday when I had class after the two teams played, and if Notre Dame won, I would always make sure that I wrote the score on the whiteboard, which made my students very angry. But I also did it on those unfortunate times when Michigan won, including that dreadful time when Michigan beat us 38-0. And so the following Monday, I walk into class with my Notre Dame stuff, having us getting hammered 38-0. And of course, I got no end of grief from my students. But I said two things to them, which I kind of enjoyed. I mean, it was fun. But I said two things to them. I said, first, I said, I wear my colors when we win, and I wear my colors when we lose. And they respected that I wasn't a fair weather fan, that I was going to be loyal. They appreciated the value of loyalty. And then I said something else. I said, I don't turn my back on my alma mater, and I expect you, my students, to follow the same principle. In other words, I'm not turning my back on my alma mater, Notre Dame, and I don't want you to turn your back on your alma mater, Michigan. At that moment, the conversation shifted entirely, because while we still were rivals, we had common ground. We believed in the same principle of loyalty and being true to your university. And I was demanding that my students always consider my alma mater to be a rival. That was a shared principle. In a lot of ways, that is what I am talking about today. We can still be rivals. We can still have different social and political viewpoints. But that doesn't mean that we can't share something that's really important too. And you can build a lot on that. And you can build a lot of civility on that as well. And that's one of the things I want to talk about here in 7 stages with respect to dogs. Now, 7 stages, meaning that I'm not talking just about telling dog stories. I love to talk about dog stories. I'll talk about a few here in a few minutes. I love to talk about dog stories, and I encourage you to tell stories about your pets too. It's great fun. You should do that. That's completely fine. But what I'm going to get to is that underneath those stories are values that we can share with other people who otherwise might seem really different than us. And I think that if we do that, even in the midst of our disagreement, we will build a platform. We will build a floor of civility and commonality that sustain us through the times when we do have to argue. Now, the first one is the notion of the pack. Dogs have a pack. They know who they belong to. They know if there are other dogs, their other dogs are part of the pack. They know the human beings are part of their pack. They know that there is an us. They have a very well-defined sense of an us. And you know, this notion of us and them gets beat up a lot these days as being a really, really bad thing. I want to challenge that a little bit. Us versus them has problems to it, because when it's us versus them, it is very easy to make the them demonized. And that's a problem. But we all have to have an us. We need an us. We don't know what to do with ourselves if we don't have an us. And us is our family, and us is our friend, and us is our team, our us is our community, our neighborhood. We need to have an us as human beings. We need to have us. And one of the ways we identify what us exists as is to have a them that we know that is not part of our thus. That's okay. It is okay to have an us and them as opposed to an us versus them. What's important is not to demonize them, so that when you're dealing with the them, you can do so in a civil way, in an appropriate way, in a gentle way. Think about when you go out and walk your dog. I have mixed success with this. With some dogs that I've had in the past, my dogs have been very good dog walkers. They've been very social, very welcoming of anybody. In fact, I had a Basset Hound, not the Basset Hound you saw earlier, but this is a Basset Hound named Rose about 15 years ago. And this was before kids. Actually, I guess it was 20 years ago. This was before kids. And my wife and I took the Basset Hound Rose and her sister Old English Sheepdog to hotels with us. I mean, they were our kids. And one time we were staying at a hotel in downtown Detroit, and Rose broke loose from me and went running over and leaped into the lap of the mayor of Detroit, who took it actually very well. But she was friendly with everybody. I mean, the mayor was them, but that doesn't mean that she was angry with them. That doesn't mean she hated them. She wanted to say, well, hello there. And so there's times you can have a socialized dog that knows who their us is, but at the same time is going to be gentle and affectionate and respectful to the them that is out there. Now, there are some times and places where you want to have your dog being protective. I'm okay with that. One of the points here is there are times and seasons for each one of these things. But the first point that I want to make is that whether you agree with someone or not, take the time to recognize that they have an us and that you have an us. And there's something important about that us before you demonize their us as being something that is negative. So the pack gives us one sense. Then there are rules. We all want rules. Dogs want rules. Dogs want to know where to go to the bathroom and what to do on a walk and when to bark and when not to bark. I mean, they want to know what the rules are so they can fit in with their pack. They want to know what it is that they're supposed to do so they can have a happy life. And so rules are important, and rules are important for us too. Rules are important to us, not only to just fit in and to know where we stand or how to interact in our family or whatever. In fact, sometimes I tell my students that a way to describe what ethics are the rules that sustain relationships. That if you want to be in a relationship, there's certain rules that go along with that. If you violate the rules, you don't have a relationship. That's true in a marriage, it's true in a friendship, it's true with international allies. There are a set of rules, the way you're supposed to conduct yourselves. Rules are important. Rules are good. Rules can be fun. In fact, if you don't have rules, some of the things that are the most fun don't exist. I have two sons. One's a soccer player, one's a baseball player. Now, if you went to the soccer practice and you started to throw the ball, you wouldn't be playing soccer anymore, and it ruins the game. If you went to the baseball practice and you started kicking the ball, same thing would happen. In order to have a game where you can have fun, you have to have the rules in order so you can have the fun. And so people may have different rules. Maybe it's not the rules that you like. Maybe it's not the game that you want to play, but you can still respect the rules and the disciplines that they have that make their pack work. Now, there's one particular rule that's particularly important, and that's the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself. And there are scholars who will say, I think quite rightly, that in every major spiritual tradition in the world, there is some version of the golden rule. Even evolutionary biologists identify this in terms of what's called reciprocal tit for tat, where you do whatever the other creature, whatever member of the species does to you. Reciprocal tit for tat, true in human beings as well. But there's also something called generous tit for tat, where you forgive, and rather than just repaying what someone just did to you, you take it up a notch. And then rather than a downward spiral of just tit for tat, then it's an upward spiral, where you're increasingly treating each other well. So when we're treating each other well is a universal rule that we can identify with, again, regardless of your political persuasion. Now, let me give you a specific example of a dog, because dogs are great examples of the golden rule. And that if you give a dog love, you give it affection, you give it training, you give it nutrition, you'll get it back a zillion times over. So I had yet another Basset. I've had a lot of Bassets in my life. This Basset hound goes back about 35 years or so. There was two Bassets, actually. There was Zeph, who I'm going to talk about, and her litter mate, Tap. So Zeph was a wonderfully gentle dog. We probably were too nice to her or too generous to her. Maybe nice is the wrong word, in that we probably fed her too many treats, because Basset hounds tend to get overweight anyway, and Zeph was really overweight in a way that I think that was not good for her. So Zeph had the unfortunate plight in life of having a real nitwit as an owner. That would be me. And back in the day, the way that you would give your dog their monthly heartworm medicine is you didn't give them one of those pills, chewable pills that they have now, and they swallow it and all that. You had a vial, some liquid, a vial that you kept in the refrigerator. And then once a month, you'd put a syringe in there, and you would draw out the amount that you needed for that particular month. And then you would squirt it into the dog's mouth, and reflexively, when it hit the dog's tongue, the dog would swallow. Now, any person with a lick of sense would have realized that you should take the needle off before squirting the liquid in the syringe into the dog's mouth. Like I said, Zeph had a nitwit of an owner who didn't do that. And so I'm squirting it in, and you know where this is going already, don't you? I squirt it in, and what happens? The needle pops off and goes onto Zeph's tongue, and she reflexively swallows it. So now she's got a hypodermic needle going down her esophagus. This is the day after Christmas in a very rural area of the Midwest. Nothing's open. My father and I call around. We finally found a veterinarian about 40 miles away. And he said, bring her over, I'll see her, and feed her as much bread as you can on the way, because the bread would clump around the needle and make it less likely that it would actually puncture something. So we jump into my dad's pickup truck, and we drove over. Dad's driving. I'm sitting there. I have Zeph on my lap, feeding her an entire loaf of bread. I mean, the dog was having a grand time. I mean, she's going on a truck ride. She's sitting in my lap. She's getting fed a whole bunch of bread. She was pretty happy. But we got over there. They took an X-ray, and the needle was very close to puncturing some organs. They said, we have to operate her. This just isn't going to go well. So they did, and they had to go in right into the bottom of her belly. And then they stitched her up. It was a big incision. I had to be away for a couple of weeks, and so the dog stayed with my parents, which they did from time to time. And one evening, just before Mom and Dad went to bed, it was 10:30 at night, something like that. My dad had one of the Bassets next to him as he was kind of drifting off to sleep watching TV, and my mom had Zeph next to her doing the same thing. And Mom looked over and saw all the stitches in Zeph's stomach had burst. And so she was just looking into her insides. So they, bundled her up, carried her to the car, drove another 40 miles to the vet that was open that particular night. And for some reason, the vet said that Zeph had to stand up. And of course, when Zeph did that, all of her intestines fell onto the floor. And she kind of growled, at first, because, that had to be an uncomfortable situation for the poor dog. And my dad started to reach over with this dog starting to growl and her guts on the floor. And Zeph looked up at my dad, saw him, and started to wag her tail. Now, it's a special dog that does that. In the midst of that pain, that trauma, when a reflex could be to bite because your existence seems to be you're in pain, she sees my dad, and because of all the love that we had given to her, she wags her tail. By the way, Zeph ended up fine. They kind of stuffed her back together and stitched her up better, and she was none the worse for the year. But that's an example of a dog with a golden rule, demonstrating that if you give something to it, how well they will return it to you. Here's another one, joy. I don't care what political persuasion that you are in. If you see a dog that's having a great time, is just as happy as possibly can be, it brings a smile to your face. I don't care whether it's swimming in the water, chasing a frisbee, cuddling with you, or whatever. And so dogs, again, can remind us of just the very basic human being experience of joyfulness. Now, the next one is one that I introduced, the next step, more from sports, but it works here too. So, in a sporting event, oftentimes you'll have the blimp, or some sort of a dirigible up there that's looking down at the field, so you can get a view of the field. And if you look down there, you can see a game that's being played, whatever the game is, and you can respect and admire all of the virtues and values that are on display: hard work, discipline, teamwork, never say die, enthusiasm. You can see all those right in front of you. But if you just move your head a little bit, you can also see City Hall, in a church, in a business, in another organization out there. And you can recognize that all those virtues and values that you see down there right in front of you on the field apply to all those other places as well. It's a sense of perspective. And since I don't have a picture from the blimp, since I've never been on a blimp, at least I can't find anyone that's not copyrighted or I could get permission for. I thought that my current basset hound, Hazel, might do us the courtesy of giving us a sense of perspective from our treehouse in the backyard. If you take a sense of perspective and step back for a second, you can see all of those values, all those virtues that we just talked about being exhibited pretty much as a fact of human society. And we can identify, again, no matter what your political beliefs are, some degree of commonality within those. Now, let me stop for a second. I don't want to be Pollyannish about this. Sometimes we disagree on important things. And sometimes people divide us in ways so that we're trying to be demonized. I'm not saying that we shouldn't stand up to that. I'm not saying that we shouldn't call out things that are just really problematic. But I am saying that sometimes the differences are exaggerated by those who would like to see them exaggerated, as opposed to what's really in the hearts of everybody on different sides of the equation. So I don't want to be Pollyannish about this, and not to say that we don't have any arguments. What I'm saying is, if you have a sense of perspective and you look at those around us and you listen to the values that they have and you share the stories that you have, there's a lot more commonality than what you might think. That includes even religion. Now, that may surprise you. But if you go back to my very first slide where I kind of showed who I was and my background and everything, you may have noticed that I have a PhD. I have a PhD in a very odd combination. It's actually a PhD in theology as applied to business, which is, I'm either inherently interdisciplinary or psychologically confused, or maybe a little both. But with my PhD in theology, I was responding to my daughter's question, the same daughter who had the basset hound ears held up a little bit earlier. So when our magnificent old English sheepdog died, when my daughter was 6 years old, the old English sheepdog Scooby had bone cancer, and we had to put her to sleep. The day after she died, my daughter asked me, "Daddy, where does Scooby go now?" Now, as someone with a PhD in theology who grew up on a farm with lots of farm animals, I've thought about that question a lot during my life. And I had an answer, actually, one that was given to me by my mother, who was the church organist for 44 years. And so I had my answer. But looking at the diversity of our children, I thought it would be kind of interesting to see what a lot of other people said about that question. So I decided to write a book of what different spiritual traditions around the world say what happens to a dog after it dies. Now, I've written a lot of books. I mean, I think I've published, I think it's 36 books. I've written a lot of books. It's what I do. This is the one book I cannot get published. I cannot get the thing published, but it's been awfully fun to write. And I had a lot of interesting experiences when I was writing the book, because I would ask people from different traditions, all kinds, different Christian denominations, non-Christian, I mean, all over the map. And it was very, very diverse of what they thought. And I would get answers, from them, and then I would share those answers. And one of the experiences that I repeatedly had was that I noticed that if two people sit down, and they're not intimate friends, they know each other, but they're not intimate friends. If the two of them sat down and one of them said, "Do you know what I believe happens to us after we die?" The other person is likely to back up a little bit. And that's stuff that we really don't talk about in society these days. It's a private thing, and so you kind of keep that to yourself, right? Keep it off the table. It's too incendiary. It's too conflictual. Everybody's going to argue about stuff like that. But I've seen this, that if you ask the same person, do you know what, fill in the blank of whatever spiritual tradition you're thinking of, believe happens to a dog after it dies? People lean forward and they say, "Know what?" They're interested. And it is a safe ground for them to learn something about a dog, but about something a lot more than a dog too. And I am convinced that it becomes a safe place, that cultural touchstones can be a safe place for us to have what otherwise may be very hard conversations. Now, the final point, depending on your source, you can draw this from the Torah, you can draw it from the Old Testament, you can draw it from a 1960s rock group called the Byrds, to everything that there is a season. Time to be born, a time to die. Yeah, I think that the lyrics or the message to that. That each one of those things that I've talked about, there's a time and a season for each of them. There's a time for joy. There's a time for perspective. There's a time for us. There's a time for the golden rule. There are times from each one of these things, and they may not all be happening at exactly the same time. And if you're talking to someone else who differs from you, they have their times and seasons too. And maybe your times and seasons are always the same. But if you can see what all those kind of 6 steps are, those 6 mindsets, those 6 ways to think about things, those 6 values, my bet is you find some degree of common ground, even amidst our differences. And even amidst a plague and social distancing, even amidst us being strangers, that we can find ways to be able to have a common ground by finding a time and season for us to relate to each other. Now, that brings me to a couple of last things. This is it's not a challenge. There's lots of challenges out there these days. I think they're cool. I have no objection to a challenge at all. This is not a challenge, it's an invitation. As we're looking forward to ending social distancing, as my sons are, to be able to get back to their soccer team, their baseball team, their friends, and things like that, I think that this is a time and season for us to try to reach out and find common ground with those with whom we disagree. So there's 2 parts to this invitation. One in the orange box with the quotation marks. Make your own list of stories that put you in the frame of mind or exemplify each one of those steps that I talked about. Us and them, rules, golden rules, as good as it gets, joy, transcendence, the blimp. Make a list of all of those. And you don't have to post it publicly, but just as a kind of a way to be accountable to yourself, send it along to an email address, strangers to friends 2020 at gmail.com, that you did this. You don't have to tell me what they are, just say that you did this. And then even more important, in the yellow box with 2 people sitting across from each other at a table, find someone who doesn't agree with you about politics, policies, whatever. Share your stories, the ones you just did in the orange box, but even better, listen to what theirs are. And then send the note that you did to the same address, strangers to friends 2020 at gmail.com. I think that this is a time and season for us to try to reach out and find, if not common ground, at least ways to respect each other. Now, one final thing before I go. My students who have had me for these 34 years will tell you that I always conclude my courses with a song. Many times I will conclude individual classes with a song. And there's a whole story about that that I won't bore you with here today. Maybe later on in the year that I will tell that story, but not today because I'm going on too long anyway. But this, one of the reasons I do this is that I think that, you know, putting words into music helps us remember something. And so I will take familiar songs, often Christmas songs, and put them with new words in order to try to summarize what the course was or a particular thing that we talked about that day. And the particular thing that I'd like to try to leave you with is to think more about not what needs to happen for you to be treated fairly, for you to be treated justly, for you to get a fair shake or you to get a fair deal. Not so much that, but what you can do in order to be treating someone else fairly and ethically and justly, how you can contribute to someone else. Now, one person who helped us think about that is in the famous prayer of St. Francis, who's also a great friend of the animals, of dogs and other animals. So he's kind of appropriate for this. And the words that I've chosen for that, I have a longer version of this, but for this is from the first part of his prayer for St. Francis. If you don't want to go along with St. Francis, you can find a very similar theme from an existentialist writer, Franz Kafka, in The Trial, where again, the notion isn't so much of complaining about that you haven't been treated fairly, but what can you do in order to treat somebody else fairly? So in order to conclude this, and this pulls from an old Irish tune. Many of you may recognize this as a tune that is in a lot of Christian hymn books. And it's written with this notion of contributing to someone else, being an instrument of peace more than having peace brought to you. Make me an instrument, Lord, of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me so love. Injury no pardon, choose faith over doubt. Swap darkness with lightness, sadness not, but joy shout. Thank you very much for being part of this today. Hope to see you next month.